Let's continue our introduction to the writing prophets with a contrast between prophets and diviners. In Mesopotamia, there was a considerable amount of divination and magical practices. There were incantations, there were amulets, there were magical rituals that took place. Many types of techniques were used for divining what would happen in the future. One of the most common ones was hepatoscopy, which has to do with the examination of livers. Compare the term hepatitis, having to do with a liver disease. But then there were other forms, just looking at other animal organs, or lecanomancy, which is oil on water, and interpretation of dreams, and astrology, and smoke from incense, and casting lots, and even ominous chance remarks from strangers was thought to be an omen of the future. Monstrous births, teratoscopy, could be thought to be a means of divination of the future. Consulting the dead, necromancy, observation of birds, Dagil Itsuri in Akkadian. There is a lot more divination, as it turns out, than what we would call prophecy in the ancient Near East. Now, the Bible distinguishes all these practices from biblical prophecy. It says, when you enter the land that the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritualist, or one who calls up the dead, for whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord. And because of these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. Divination is not prophecy, and that's in part because no God is involved. Divination read the fates. The Akkadian term is Shimtu. They didn't necessarily consult with even a pagan god. Now, one of the terms for a pagan priest is a baru, which means a seer, a seer. A baru was a divination priest that practiced extipacy, that is animal parts, divining from animal parts, especially livers. And they'd ask questions and then cut open the animal to see if the shape confirmed their question or denied their question. They also practice oil on water, lecanomancy. Now, was the title seer in Hebrew influenced by the existence of the Baru divination priests in Mesopotamia? We saw that one term for seer, ro'eh, went into disuse, and it could be that term ro'eh was used both for prophets like Samuel, but also used for diviners. And because of the association with diviners, it fell into disuse. Were there prophets in Mesopotamia? And the answer is yes, but not much. We see examples of pagan prophecy at a site called Mari. It would be kind of along the border of Syria and Iraq, along the Euphrates River. There, some Mari prophets show up. They have different titles. One is called a mahu, which means something like a madman or an ecstatic. And then there was the apilu, who was an answerer. He would ask a question. You'd ask a question of the god, and the apilu would give the answer. And then there would be the asinu, part of the cultic staff of Ishtar temples. Here's an example of a pagan prophecy at Mari. Speak to my lord the message of the lady Shimtu. In the temple of the goddess Anunitum, Shalibum became ecstatic. Thus says Ananitum, O Zimri-Lin, they will test you in a revolt. Take care of yourself. Set around you trustworthy servants whom you love. And as for the men who are testing you, I will hand over these men to you. There you have the lady Sheb who speaks in the name of a goddess, Ananitum, and that's an example of a pagan prophecy. Here's another one. While I was prostrated, Dagon opened his mouth and spoke as follows. Have the leaders of the Ammonites and the troops made peace with Zimri-Lim's army which went up? And I replied, they have not made peace. And before I left, he spoke as follows. The messengers of Zimri-Lim, why are they not regularly with me? If he had done so, I would have put the leaders of the Ammonites into Zimri-Lim's hands. Go now, I am sending you to Zimri-Lim, and this is what you shall say. Send your messengers to me. Now here you have the god Dagon speaking to and through a prophet, a pagan prophet. Same Dagon that's in the Bible, the one that whose statue fell down and worshipped the ark in the book of 1 Samuel. But Dagon complains that, well, you haven't come and you haven't come to worship me often enough. If you'd had, I'd given you a revelation that would have given Zimri, the Ammonites, into your hand, O King Zimri-Lin. So anyway, that's another example of a prophecy at Mari. Well, what are we to make of these extra-biblical Mari prophecies? Well, the liberal view is that the Hebrews may have borrowed the whole idea of prophecy from Mesopotamia. My view is that there's significant differences between Mari prophets in the Bible. For one thing, they're geographically and chronologically remote. The Mari prophets date to around 1700 BC, whereas the biblical prophets are considerably after that. Moreover, geographically, they're not close to where Israel was. Moreover, in most of the cases, there is revelation. My slide here is wrong. There is revelation, but there's no commission. That is, a lot of these are just private revelations to people, and therefore they would not be prophets under the definition we gave. There's also some prophecy in some other places. In Assyria in the 7th century BC, down to the 7th century BC, you have accounts of revelation to Ashurbanipal and Esarhaddon. We also have prophecy in Canaan, the story of Win-Ammon, an 11th century kind of travel log of Win-Ammon, an Egyptian official who traveled up to Byblos, which is up in Syro-Palestine. At Byblos, a young man of Byblos went into an ecstatic frenzy and gave an oracle that Win-Ammon represented the Egyptian god Ammon and should be allowed to present his message. Another prophecy in Canaan is a prophecy of the god Baal Shemin, which means Lord of Heaven, to Zakir, king of Hamath, concerning Ben-Hadad of Syria, an 8th century prophecy. We also have reference to a prophecy of Mesha, king of Moab, in the Moabite stone, the Mesha inscription. Again, in Egypt, there's very little of what is even remotely resembling prophecy. And the examples of prophecy I've just given mostly exhaust the genre of anything that resembles biblical prophecy. So was Israel influenced by Mesopotamian prophecy? Again, Mesopotamia primarily emphasized divination, not prophecy. Real prophecy in the sense of someone serving as a spokesman for a god is rare. Divination is far more common. And so there's no real convincing evidence of direct influence on Israel. I guess what you could say is that If you believe in a God, you might expect him to speak somehow and that he might use a human agent to do that. But anyway, this backdrop does explain why one term for seer fell into disuse, that Hebrew word roeh, because it may have been confused with like a Baru priest, whose name also means a seer. Some other questions. Were the prophets ecstatics? That is, did they go into ecstatic states, states of possession in which the prophet was possessed by the Spirit of God and loses control of himself or herself? Well, there's evidence on both sides of that question in favor of their going into ecstatic states. Are passages in Samuel where it speaks of Saul, for example, in 1 Samuel 19, he was going out to arrest David, but then the Spirit of God came upon him and he prophesied with Samuel and the sons of the prophets, did so all night, woke up naked in the morning, having stripped himself while he was prophesying, and it seems like he was in a state of possession, that God possessed him so that he couldn't do what he intended to do, which was arrest David. In 1 Samuel 18:10, it says that Saul raved and then threw his spear at David. But the root of that is Navi, or Navah, which is related to Navi, prophet. And you could translate it, he acted like a prophet. He was in a state of possession. He was possessed and behaved irrationally. Hosea 9, 7 and 8 speaks of a prophet as a fool or a maniac, uses that kind of terminology that would go along with the idea that prophets sometimes went into states of ecstatic possession. On the other hand, there are arguments against the view that prophets went into ecstatic states. Saul, for example, may have been a special case. God had to intervene and possess Saul so that Saul would not do David harm. He was out to arrest Saul in 1 Samuel 19. And so it may not be typical of prophets. It may be just a special case with Saul. You have a contrasting case with Elijah, who on Mount Carmel in 1 Samuel 18 is completely cool, calm, and collected, while the pagan prophets seem to go into ecstatic states of possession, cutting themselves and prancing about. Elijah was cool, and calm, unlike pagan prophets. That suggests that ecstatic states are not typical of prophets. To prophesy in Samuel and the sons of the prophets may be also a different meaning of prophesy. They were prophesying in kind of a worship setting. There's evidence in 1 Chronicles 25, 1 through 3, where the root navah can mean to praise or to worship, as in a worship sort of setting. And it may be that Saul didn't prophesy in the sense of making prophetic utterances, but he prophesied in that secondary sense so that he was caught up in the worship. In any case, the writing prophets show little evidence of going into ecstatic states. I think the best we can say is that, well, perhaps sometimes the prophets went into states of possession, but we certainly can't say that that was a general rule. We'll finish our introduction to the prophets in the next video.